Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is Friday evening on the 23rd of January, and I'm delighted to welcome onto the show a good friend of mine, Lieutenant Colonel retired Daniel L. Davis, more famously known from the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. It's hugely successful geopolitics and political military kind of podcast that he runs with a massive following. And I've been fortunate enough to appear on that and also actually have dinner with Danny in London a couple of years back when he was passing through. Danny, absolutely privileged to have you here. Thank you so much for taking the time. I know you're an incredibly busy man.
Delighted to be here, and we'll have to get back together for lunch again soon. We'll have to go back to London.
We should, or I should come out of there, one or the other. We'll find a way. Let-
Always
let-
welcome here.
yeah, no, I do love your country very much. Now, Donald Trump has got all the European leaders in a massive, and actually most of the media in a massive performative flap, about his latest comments on Afghanistan in particular, where you and I actually both served. I mean, I wasn't military; I was diplomatic, so I wasn't facing the danger, that you were facing. Um, but this to me is, I mean, I found his comments, teasing EU leaders about other things, slightly amusing at times in the past. I have to say, this feels different because I know that some British troops, you know, obviously the US troops far outnumber the British there and in the, Operation Desert Storm, the Iraq War, and so on and so forth. But we had a hefty contingent. We lost 457 men and women.
Yeah.
So that's really hacked off a whole nation here. If I'm completely honest. What do you think's behind it? What do you think's behind it?
Man, I don't know. That's just something when I actually heard about that. I was on somebody else's show earlier and was asked about it. I hadn't even seen it at the time, and when I was told what he said, I was just almost in disbelief because I mean I had two combat deployments there. I've had numerous operational deployments elsewhere where there's British troops, where there's NATO troops that are involved. And my personal observation has been, I mean, number one, you don't have to have taken anybody's word for anything. I mean, British were on the front lines, as you mentioned, all the casualties they suffered, but they were also a lot of the leading areas in some of the southern part of the country. Just watch any number of movies and other kinds of analysis on YouTube where it's self-evident. You can see that they were right there on the front line in the line of fire. And my observation was, and I have some issues with NATO, especially at the leader level, but I'm telling you, throughout my whole military career at the tactical level, I have nothing but the highest admiration, especially for British troops, that I never ever had any kind of a question about their capabilities, about their dedication, or their courage under fire. I mean, it was absolutely beyond question to me. And to why Trump would even want to say things that implied that they were not courageous, that they were not on the front lines, when it's just patently obvious that they were. I don't understand what he thinks he's going to gain by this, or why he would think anyone would. I don't even know what his objectives would be into saying this stuff. Even if he thought it was true, why would you want to say something like that? But it's not true. So even more so, why would you want to say that? You can have legitimate issues at the leader level, at the policy level. Those are fair game. You and I've talked about a lot of those, but not on the ground where they're fought. And I don't think anyone should question the bravery and the courage of the British. And in fact, I also spent a lot of time with German troops there. I wouldn't question a single one of them under fire in Afghanistan.
Yeah, I mean, I was there during Operation Moshtarak, which is one of the hottest periods in the conflict. I wasn't fighting; I was kind of on the base, but we were losing between 3 and 5 personnel every week, and that is obviously nothing compared to what's happening in Ukraine. But by modern standards, that's quite a high body count. So I'd go to the weekly vigils, where out on the parade square with the troops, and
Right.
there's always a deeply moving experience. So yeah, I mean, there's a whole debate. I mean, I've seen the thread of why he's trying to wind up the Europeans on the Ukraine settlement because they've been blockers. There seems no logic to this. It goes to the argument of is he just slightly autistic or is he just being offensive? And yeah, I agree with you that there's no kind of obvious rhyme or reason uh, to this bizarre sort of outburst. But on Ukraine, that seems to be shuffling along. I mean, the Russians have shifted to strategic bombardments of critical infrastructure, cutting off massively, kind of disrupting power. in Kiev and other cities, it feels less about the front foot on the battlefield because of winter conditions right now. Hottest winter since 1987, apparently, in Ukraine. But there's not a lot of movement on the front line. It's all much more about kind of cutting off Ukrainian citizens from heat, basically, to kind of undermine their support for the war. But Trump actually, and I give him a lot of credit for this. I mean, I'm shocked by what he said about Afghanistan, but I do think he's been trying to kind of secure a settlement. And now we've got this latest protesting process, in the United Arab Emirates. I mean, do you think we are edging closer, or do you still think the Europeans and the Ukrainians are basically trying to kind of drag it back, to the greatest extent that they can?
Well, I think that the Europeans and the Ukrainians have been trying to do that just nonstop for the 12 months that President Trump has been in office. And I perceive that we are getting to a point of decision where President Trump is making it known behind the scenes, both to Ukraine and to the Europeans, that his patience has run out. And I think that the one of the negotiations that they're doing in Moscow yesterday, and apparently there's some in Abu Dhabi, maybe even right now while we're on the air, I'm not sure. There's going to be a three-way meeting between Ukraine, Russia, and the United States. So we'll see what comes of that. The whole lot will depend on what happens with that. But to me, the biggest indicator that we're getting close to the end game here, and that Trump has told Zelensky that it's probably time to either shut up and do what I told you to do, or you're going to be on your own with Ukraine, with Europe. Because when you look at how Zelensky responded in his Davos meeting yesterday, I mean, I was nearly shocked because he's historically kind of tried to play the peacemaker and lather people up with compliments, both the Europeans and the United States, and then talk about some things he wants more of and a little bit of complaints why he's not getting X, Y, or Z. But this time, he just flat out came out against both Europe and the United States and said, I'm tired of all this talking. You guys keep saying you're going to do a bunch of stuff and you don't ever do it. And then he flat out took on the European leaders as a whole. And there aren't that many of them he could have been talking about and saying, listen, all you do is talk a good game. And it seems like all you do is talk when it comes time for elections, but then you don't put up and you're waiting for somebody else to tell you when you can rise up, meaning, of course, the United States. So he was literally mocking them all, and he was very angry in his comments. And I perceive that he would only have done that if he believes that he has nothing to lose by doing that. I don't know if he thinks he's going to talk somebody into something or if he's going to shame somebody in either the United States or Europe into changing their position. He's not going to succeed if that's what he's thinking. But I think that was a big warning sign to me. And the fact that you see the Russians have not budged an inch from June of 2024 all the way through this current phase right here now into 2026, I think that they're saying, look, we mean what we say. And when Yushikov said this earlier today, he said, either we're going to get the negotiated settlement on the terms that we're willing to settle for, or we're just going to take it in the special military operation on the ground. And Russia has the wherewithal to do that. We don't have the capacity to resist that, even if it takes a lot longer. You talked about the fact that there hadn't been a lot of progress in the last month or so. Part of that has to do with the weather, but there has still been a huge body count for the Ukraine side because Russia's focus remains primarily the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces and secondarily on territory. Obviously, that's important because that's one of the things that both Peskov and Lavrov said yesterday, that they said, we're going to get all the territory we're asking for in the Donbass and elsewhere, or we're going to keep fighting. So they care about that, but their priority is to preserve their own manpower while maximizing firepower to destroy the other side. And if it takes a long time, they're apparently okay with that. They're not on the same timeline that the Western seems to be. We want to get it done right now,
Yeah.
and that they can do that, though. That's the big issue to me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree, and I've been saying this for a long time, as you know, that they can afford to wait because they have the strategic resources and the military-industrial complex that can produce the munitions that they need, plus the replacement rate in terms of recruitment into the armed forces, without the need for any kind of formal mobilization. So it is just a bigger country. It can, economies win our wars, not armies, as they say. And
Very well put.
Russia is just bigger. But I mean, I saw Zelensky's comments as that he was cornered. And if you compare Ushakov's comments today, for Ushakov, he was
He's
remarkably
not
upbeat.
cornered.
And that
right?
for me was a fascinating contrast between the two, because
And
actually,
and I'll add into that, Ian, also the tepidness of the European response. Nobody came out and either said, "Oh no, no, Zelensky, we're all in with you." They didn't condemn him. They was just kind of quiet, which to me is more evidence that I think we're getting close to the end game because they're starting to, I guess, kind of curtail their comments here because I think that the Greenland issue had a big impact on this, and I hope that we got this resolved and that Trump is recognizing that it would be foolhardy to try and coerce and compel some kind of compliance. We're still not out of the woods. He gave a 2 week priority, but clearly the Europeans have prioritized keeping NATO together above even doing anything for Ukraine. And they feel, and I think probably justifiably, that if there was a rupture either over the Russia Ukraine or over the Greenland thing, that NATO itself could just
yeah.
spin apart, and then they're not ready to take that. I think many of them, and you can tell me if you agree or not. I think many in Europe are believing that that is the future. That eventually they're going to have to take back over the lead, but they're not ready to do it right now because of all the years of trusting and relying on the United States, especially in the defense industrial capacity. They just don't have the wherewithal to take it over yet. But I think that the writing is on the wall.
Yeah, I agree, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But on the Greenland thing, I mean, I suspect that the USA is going to play the long game on it because it is a legally ambiguous Greenland status. The Greenland people do ultimately have the right of self-determination if they choose to do so under a 2009 Act. Uh, so that if the price is right, I mean, I wouldn't rule out in the next few years the Greenland's taking a choice, and I think I suspect that the Trump administration will choose to play the long game on it and continue to offer sort of incentives, financial incentives, essentially, to do that beyond any sort of short-term deal that they
I
fix up
don't know
with the
what
Danes.
would anyone would gain from saying, okay, the U.S. is going to start spending money in Greenland and supporting all of that stuff when we don't
No,
need
no,
to and we haven't been doing.
yeah,
That's
no.
not a winning play for Trump.
I'm
So
not. I'm
I
not
don't know
saying.
if that's going to work.
Yeah, no, I'm not. I'm not saying that I agree, but just looking at it
Well,
rationally. I
no, I
mean,
understand. I'm just saying from Trump's perspective, why do you want to play that long game? That's not one you want to play because to win that one is to lose. So,
yeah,
recommend that we just put this off and just say, okay, we'll agree to whatever you guys want to do is just expand some bases if you need to do that. But we'll keep everything else as is and move on to whatever's next. That's the least offensive play to go.
yeah. Well, no, I agree with you on that. But let's watch this space because of Trump's unpredictability. I mean, I think back to the Ukraine point, it's exactly right that the Europeans are weak and tepid. On even on the 5% NATO expansion commitment. Even the British are sort of soft pedaling on that. The British Army gets smaller, slightly smaller, every year because we have massive recruitment problems. We just can't recruit enough people, and too many people are leaving. The armed forces, and yet still we're talking about the possibility of war with Russia within 5 years or 4 years or 3 years. Believe whichever number that you will. And so it is hard to separate that rhetoric from this desire, which you rightly point out amongst European leaders, to cling on to NATO, because I think in the backs of people's minds, they have humoured Trump up until now because they want to keep NATO together. And that is going to be increasingly tested, I suspect, over the coming sort of 3 remaining years of his presidency. But I mean, it's too early to call which way that's going to go. But I mean, do you see any? I mean, this is a rhetorical question, but I mean, do you see any evidence that actually the Russians, want to invade Europe next? A rhetorical question,
No,
as I
in
said.
fact, and I'm of the kind that I don't care what Russia says per se. I listen to what they say because it's all often when the words and the actions match, then you can put some stock in that. When the words and the actions don't match, then you can just ignore that. So I listen, but in all cases, I look at what they can do. When you look at how Russia fights and how their army has been constructed, they have built a system that requires long logistic lines, and they rely on rail lines to be able to project power on the ground. And when you look at the system that they have designed, they can go about 180 kilometers max beyond the end of their rail lines. So if you had any fantasies about taking over Europe, you're going to have rail lines that don't exist right now and that are very vulnerable to attack. So right now, about the best that Ukraine can do is, as they could probably, Russia rather, is they could effectively push out to the Dnieper River. They could probably push as far as Kiev, and they could push as far as Transnistria in the south through Odessa, etc. And they could take all of that stuff because the lines of logistics allow them to do that, and they can drive trucks and stuff. But even to take the western part of Ukraine would put them under enormous strains. They would have to build new rail lines, which take a long time, and you can do it, or they would have to completely change their logistics system, but that would require a lot more assets that they don't currently have. So, whatever they may desire, whatever we may fear, until you see that they have the ability to project power at a rapid pace and large scale across hundreds of kilometers of territory, then you don't even have to be worried because Russia can't do it. And there's a lot of weakness in the NATO ground forces that I could talk about at length. But the NATO air power and the NATO missile power is still quite substantial. And should Russia try to test that and to proceed, even to try to go a couple hundred kilometers in, I mean, they're just going to get mauled and chewed up. And why would Russia do that? They have nothing to gain by taking into territory. What they want, and they have said since 2007, is security on their western flank. And they don't want Ukraine to be a conduit for NATO, which could have, if you look at a map, it's almost like an arrow pointing right to Moscow on an invasion route that's been used before. That's what they care about. That's what they've said, and that's what their defensive capacity allows them to do. So when it comes to whether they would come forward, even though that's accused almost left and right to build up fear in the West, they don't actually have the capacity to do it, whatever they may want to do, whatever we accuse them of doing. So, no, I don't see any chance that Russia would do something that's illogical and for which they can't do anyway.
Yeah, well, I mean that's gold-plated actually military analysis, frankly, which I think people will find incredibly helpful. And as I said, it was a rhetorical question, and I obviously completely agree with you. There's never been any evidence that, that Russia plans to roll into, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, pick a country. And I mean, I've driven from the Russian border all the way across Ukraine to
And, and,
Poland.
and by the way, I would
It's a
point out
very
that
long way.
Russia does have the capacity to take the Baltics. If push comes to shove, and for whatever reason, whether we were trying to threaten them or they felt threatened, they
Oh yeah,
could do
they
that.
do.
They have the capacity, but they couldn't go any further than that. And they know that that is an Article 5 trigger, which there would have to be a profoundly important reason. And I just don't see them doing that.
Exactly right. I completely agree. I mean, that Lukashenko will let them go through Belarus, and they could walk straight in. Within a couple of days, it'll be over. But why would they? People
Right.
say, well, they
That's
go through
exactly right.
people say, well, they could go through the Suwalki Gap and just you know create a corridor to Kaliningrad. But why would they? Because exactly the point you make, it would be an Article 5 trigger, and Russia knows that it would be in serious trouble because of the economic system. I mean, it's just militarily, it might be a fierce fight, but actually the economics would very, very quickly stack up against them in that situation. Putin knows it, we know it, and yet we still talk about
And
these
and I
fantasies.
think many people in Russia, the Russian population, I think that they are completely behind Putin with what it is going on in the Donbass and with the Russian speakers, et cetera. And they're willing to pay a big price to get the protection of their ethnic brethren there. But if you expanded it when you didn't have to, and you took on a new enemy, and all of a sudden a bunch of Russians were getting killed, and it spread out, then I don't know that they would support that. And so I think that that by itself might keep Putin from going any further.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure they wouldn't. Certainly, from I still have Russian, friends, and actually the Russians, or the Russia that I know, even actually within Putin's inner circle, there's that unstated longing still to be part of the European family. There's that kind of feeling of being excluded. There's don't need to get into the roots of discussion of how that's come about, but I mean, there is a desire ultimately, I feel, to have some sort of rapprochement with albeit on terms of equal partnership, not on terms in which they are subjugated and so on.
And
Do you
Russia
think
has
this?
even said in recent weeks that they desire a European-wide security architecture that includes everybody's safety. They're still saying that too, and I don't think that's just words.
Yeah, I mean exactly, indivisibility of security. Exactly. I mean that was the discussion about the treaty in back in 2021 for that the war actually kicked off. Of course, I mean it's absolutely right and completely necessary. But that then raises the question: Does NATO really have a future long term?
I don't think so. I actually did a show on my channel a week or so ago where I argued that if NATO wanted to be wise at the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and all of the casus belli for the existence, the legitimate existence of NATO from 1949 up to that point, vanished. And so there's no point in doing that anymore. So we should have disbanded then and worked on a European wide security architecture where everybody could feel safe. Everybody. Then there would be no reason. But too
Yeah.
many people in the West know we need to have an enemy, so we're going to keep Russia as the enemy. And I think that unnecessarily we kept it, we expanded it, and I think that will ultimately prove the undoing. And instead of having a nice roll down at our choice, at our pace, where you could have a big parade and and congratulations and everybody feel good, instead I think it's going to collapse and fall apart, and it's going to be a disaster.
Completely agree. Danny Davis, Lieutenant Colonel retired Daniel L. Davis, complete megastar, a top class analysis as always. Thank you so much. I hope the readers have found it really interesting and instructive. I mean, it always is. Talking to Danny. So thank you all for watching as always. As I just get started, I've been delighted with the support I've already had so far. So please keep that up and like and subscribe to my show. And I wish you all very much peace and God bless you, Danny Davis. Thanks very much. Hope to catch up again soon.
Thanks very much. Always a pleasure.